And today's event is actually timely on so many levels. We do remember the over 100,000 Jews who were killed 100 years ago as part of the anti-Jewish pogroms in Eastern Europe, which is the topic of this book. We often think that the atrocities of World War I were actually over with the end of the war in 1918, but for many people in Eastern Europe, the worst was still to come during the infighting of the following years. And these years saw the worst anti-Jewish violence before the Holocaust. Also, tomorrow, commemorating the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, is also International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And finally, the events of this book do relate directly and in some way tragically to our own time, when the outbreak of new violence in Ukraine is feared by many observers. So it is my real pleasure, true pleasure, to introduce my dear colleague Jeffrey Veidlinger. He's a professor of history and Judaic studies at the University of Michigan, and before that, he taught for many years at Indiana University. His books, which include the Moscow State Yiddish Theater and In the Shadow of the Shtetl, have won a National Jewish Book Award, the Barnett Hewitt Award for Theater Scholarship, 2 Canadian Jewish Book Awards, and the J.I. Siegel Award. He will be speaking today about his new book, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918 to 1921, and the onset of the Holocaust. In the Midst of Civilized Europe has just been named a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in History. And without any further ado, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks, Pam, for inviting me. And thanks, Laura, for making it possible and organizing it. And thank you, everybody, for coming out today. We are right in the week of International Holocaust Remembrance Week, as well as Michael mentioned, sitting here as it is possible that Russia and Ukraine will again soon be at war, which unfortunately makes this talk more relevant than I would like it to be. I tend to work on issues relating to the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, genocide studies, and it's always not a good sign when what I'm talking about is relevant. But yet, once again, we're in that situation. So again, thank you all for coming and thank you for being here. And I will be talking today about the book that Michael mentioned that had recently come out, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918 to 1921, and the onset of the Holocaust. And I'm going to actually share my screen and talk some slides for a little bit. So just bear with me a minute while I move over to the screen. And hopefully you can all see my screen now. So this is the cover of the book that I have that had recently come out. But I'm going to begin with this photo, which is a photo of my father as a young child with his parents and a neighbor sitting on their balcony in Budapest. And you can see it looks like a very nice family picture, family photo of the whole family, of a loving family together, enjoying what's perhaps a nice fall day. Until you notice, of course, that they were all wearing yellow stars. I grew up the son of a Holocaust survivor and was brought up with the notion that the Holocaust was unimaginable before it happened. And I think in many ways that's true. You know, my father often talked about how as a child in Budapest, he would go on family vacations to Lake Balaton. He enjoyed skiing lessons and would go skiing in the Alps. He was a fencer. He went to Hebrew school near his home and lived in a Jewish neighborhood, in a Jewish milieu, with parents who practiced Orthodox Judaism in Budapest. And then suddenly things changed for him. Suddenly he was taken out of that middle class world. The Nazis invaded Hungary and then Budapest, and everything changed. In a way, the Holocaust came to him out of the blue. And in fact, that's the image that we're given of the Holocaust so often in literature, in museums, in memoirs. When you think of the two most prominent memoirists or diarists of the Holocaust, Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel, both of them present it that way. Both of them talk about their early life, which was, in Anne Frank's case, a typical middle-class life until she was forced to flee and then later forced to go into hiding. And for Elie Wiesel also, he was living a very orthodox religious life in Szeged Marmaros until the Nazis came in and radically changed his life, first setting up a ghetto in Szeged and then deporting him and the rest of his community to Auschwitz. And this is the way we think of the Holocaust, unimaginable as having come out of the blue. There's a Holocaust museum near where I live. I live in Ann Arbor, and in Farmington Hills, Michigan, there's a big Holocaust museum, and it presents exactly this vision of the Holocaust. When you enter the museum, there's a big, open, airy room that has all types of displays about Jewish life before the war. One display shows all of the journals and newspapers that were published by various Jewish communities in the interwar period. Another exhibit shows Jewish religious life and shows artifacts of Shabbat and of Passover and of other holidays and Jewish people celebrating their religion. And another shows Jewish youth groups and Jewish political movements. So it shows really a middle class, what we would think of as a normal Jewish life. And then at this museum, you move from this big open room, and there's a very narrow corridor that slopes down. And at the end of the corridor is an enormous portrait of Adolf Hitler. And it gives the impression that suddenly we move from what we would consider a normal middle class, or even lower class or upper class life, and Hitler emerges and everything changes on a dime. Now, in a way, that narrative is true for many people, including for my father, for Elie Wiesel, for Anne Frank, and for millions of other people. That is exactly how their life progressed. So I'm not disputing that vision. But at the same time, for other people, particularly for the people that I study, the Holocaust began on fertile ground in Ukraine. In Ukraine, which the area that I'm studying, the Germans, when they came in June of 1941, stepped into what was already a well-established killing ground, where the murder of Jews in their communities was not only conceivable, but was part of recent memory, was part of the legacy of these towns in which the Germans entered. Between November 1918 and March 1921, during the Civil War that took place following the collapse of the Tsarist Empire and the Bolshevik Revolution, and then following the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and German empires, about 100,000 Jews were killed in ethnic violence in about 2,000 separate incidents in around 500 different towns. And I don't know how well you can see this map, but it shows circles proportional to the size of the number of people who were killed in all of the towns that I was able to document pogroms taking place. And you can see that some of these pogroms, and by pogrom, I mean really a pogrom is any type of violence against Jews. We usually think of it as a race riot, and often it was a race riot. Often it was ethnic violence of the local population committing atrocities against their Jewish neighbors. At other times, it was more of a military action of military units moving from town to town, rounding up Jews and killing them. So we have these incidents in all of these towns, about 2,000 incidents between November 19 and March 1921. Now, what struck me when I was learning about these is that they occur in precisely the same places where the first mass killings of Jews took place during World War II. This is also the territory where the Holocaust began, where the Holocaust in earnest began, where the Germans started rounding up Jews and killing them. And when they were doing so, again, they were doing so in villages that had had this experience only 20 years earlier. When you think about that, that's a very short period of time 20 years. That's really just less than a generation. It means that people who were in their tens, who were in their teens in 1919, were in their 30s in 1941 when the Germans came in. And again, the rounding up of Jews was not something inconceivable, but something that had already happened in recent memory. And the towns were still in the process of recovering from that type of violence, because you can imagine the impact of violence on that level in the town just 20 years later. I first became aware of the extent of this violence when I was conducting oral history interviews in Ukraine between 2002 and 2010 or so. I would go every summer with a group of scholars led by my colleague Dovber Kerler, and we would interview people in Yiddish about their experiences living in Ukraine over the course of the century. And time again, people talked about the pogroms of 1918 to 1921 in many of the same terms that they talked about the violence of the Holocaust. And it made me realize that in their minds, the violence of the Holocaust is often just another occurrence of a type of violence, type of bloodshed that they had already become used to. So I'm going to play you a couple of clips of these videos and show you also in the clips, they talk about some of the different types of pogroms that took place. I said there were about 2,000 pogroms, and those pogroms took radically different forms. So I want to talk a little bit about them when I play you these clips. So the first one is a fellow by the name of Nisan Yurkovetsky. We interviewed him in the town of Tulchin. And he was born in, I think it was 1917, 1918, he was a year or so old when the pogroms started in his town. And he was just a child being held by his mother. And he's going to tell the story of how his mother was killed while she was holding him in her arms. And in fact, his entire family was massacred and left in a mass grave. And he was found alive by a Polish priest who was walking by and saw that there was a child alive in this grave and saved him and brought him out. And he's going to roll up his sleeve, you'll see, and he'll show on his arm where there is a scar from the bullet that killed his mother and grazed his arm as she was holding him in her arms. So I'm going to play you this video, hopefully. There we go. And it's in Yiddish, but there's subtitles.
Ein Futter mit einem Meter hat ein Dragit. In 19 Jahren, das gewinnt in ganzen 2 Jahren. Oh! Wer hat sich Dragit? Bandeljachowitsch. Hat geschossen, der Bandit. Ist der geflogen, der Pulle. Hat es, hat Semen. Und da kriegt sie Porach. Wieder. Ja, das schon, ja. Hat man hintergenommen. Apolik haben wir hintergenommen. Das ist über in der Aktions Afnugel. Und hat noch angenommen. Gerottet, hat geschollen, wird mir. Hat noch bei mir auf Futter. Wenn wir mir ein paar machen auf Futter. Auch so, du bei mir habe ich gemacht auf Futter, in einem Meter, in einer Seide, ein Schnader. Wie hat der Meter gegessen? Giekel. Beide sind gewähnt von dort? Von Schicke, ja. Schicke ist von Dolcin. Ne, Schicke, der Futtermann hat gegessen Schicke. Ja, er ist von Dolcin. Ja, ich bin ein paar gemacht. Hat nicht gefragt, im 19. Jahr. Ich bin ein Pogrom. In Tulchin, immer ausgearbeitet, wo ich bin. Zusammen nicht, das ausgearbeitet, mehr Rossolele. Ist auch ausgegangen, ein Gordischer, ein Golach. Barduchan. Und hat Probe die Banditen. En zijn het er ook een van Ladege.
I'll end it there. So there's a lot that you can hear in that video about the pogrom in Tulchin, which is really one paradigm of the pogroms that we're talking about. This seemed to be what we would really call a race riot. He knows, and this interview is taking place, by the way, 80 years after the pogrom that he's describing, and you can see the impact that the pogrom still has on him. You can feel the pain in his voice, talking about what happened. Obviously, his family was killed. That's going to have an impact on him for 80 years. You can only imagine the impact that this type of violence has on a town 20 years later, a mere 20 years later. It was a local pogrom. He knows the name of the gang, the local gang that perpetrated, the Lechovich gang. We can assume that Lechovich was a peasant from the neighboring village, who, local toughs who came about and perpetrated this violence against the town. These were really, there was a period in Ukraine where all authority broke down. And it was just these warlords, insurgent fighters who were taking up arms against the towns. And it's in many ways a battle of the villages against the towns. And Tulchin was a victim of that, and Yurkovetsky was a victim of that, as these peasants came into town and killed his family. So it's small scale. It's neighbors killing neighbors in this town. And it lasts 8 days, he says, that the whole violence lasted 8 days. And then it came to an end, particularly the massacre itself, came to an end when the priest, the Polish priest, intervened and said, enough already, everybody home, everybody go home. And they left and they went home. So this is, again, a small scale pogrom. And many of the 2,000 pogroms that I have identified were of this nature. They were neighbors against neighbors. The next pogrom that I want to talk about, or the next model of pogrom really, is the pogrom in Proskuriv, which is a town just what was on the Ukrainian-Polish border at the time. And this was a military pogrom, very different in style from the Tulchin pogrom. This was a military unit of the Ukrainian state just a month after a Ukrainian state had been declared. Ukraine had declared its independence from the Russian Empire, which had just collapsed. And Ukraine declared its independence. It mustered up an army, and individual units of that army perpetrated atrocities against the Jews. And in this case, the pogrom took place over 4 hours, not over 8 days, over 4 hours. It was a very condensed time period. And it was military units going door to door, rounding up Jews and killing them. And we will hear Naum Geiviker describe how that occurred for him in describing his experience with it. In this pogrom in Proskuriv was probably the largest pogrom of the era, and in fact was probably up until that time the largest tragedy, the largest scale tragedy to befall the entire Jewish people during a very long period of oppression. We know that between 900 and 2,000 people were killed in 4 hours of violence in this town. Geiviker himself doesn't talk much in this video. It's more his wife who's telling his story, and he's nodding along. But I'll play it and see what this is about.
Also gewesen 6 Jahre ist gewesen der Pogrome gewesen. Und der Groß, was hat gewohnt so mit Jiden.
Wie geheißen der Groß?
Saborn hat geheißen der Groß. Besant ist
Das
das
ist am Zentrum, ja, das ist im Zentrum Stutt.
Da wie der Market ist das da bei uns. Wer hat sich kein Boten, hat sich geboten, aber wir sind ungefähr ja Jidene. Da. Da Tote Sana mit der Eltern, mit der kleineren Schwester, und später zu gehen auf den Boden, und hat sich dort geboten. Mit der Matschche sind gestanden hinten. Und der ganze Goss hat nun Argen in die Jiden. Man hat nun Argen in die Jiden. Und wir sagen zu seinen Stiebern, gibt Gold oder Belohnt gibt. Und sie sind gewinnt stark Kuren, so haben gar nicht Gold, so haben wir haben gar nicht. Ob die Gäste gar nicht, dann hat sie aufnehmen den Kopf. Na, wo hat getan in Drößen, haben sie nicht gewusst, aber sie haben nur gehört, einmal geschrien, gewollt hat geschrien. In der Zeit hat nun gegeben zu pfeifen. Wir sollen sich sebereien, die Natscheiße soll sich sebereien. Und genommen der Bandit, das hat sich gewollt drargenen, und hat genommen der Schaschgesanen, hat angelegt im Futlar und ist rausgegangen. In der Zeit sind sie geblieben leben. Nur wenn sie rausgegangen in Drößen raus, haben sie gesehen, du liegen Cap, du liegen End, du liegen Fies, und alle seine Chavere haben Neues gearbeitet. Und ist mit der Matschach geblieben leben. Wopsem alle Jungen haben sich gemischt, alle Jungen.
In nur dem seinen Ahn, der Paljaken, hat sie genommen dem Toten, auf anderem Geduschen, als ne gewesen, wir haben gemeint, mit ihm gearbeitet, mit ihm hat sie genommen, jetzt in der Welt, so gesogen, die Ambasure, die haben, wopsem sie gewesen, freilich du. Ich habe überlebt,
Okay, so in that clip, again, you see an organized pogrom perpetrated by a military unit that begins with a whistle, they say, that signified to the people to carry out the violence. And then over the course of 4 hours on February 15th, 1919, somewhere between 900 to 2,000 Jews are killed in this organized violence. I just have this up because I want to say that all of these videos and many more of them are online on the website that I maintain called the Archives of Historical and Ethnographic Yiddish Memories, which is part of this oral history project that I was doing with Dovber Kurler. And you can access it from my own personal website, veidlinger.org, or ahaim.org will take you there. So how do we know that that many people were killed? Well, one way we know is from lists that were taken of the dead. And here you can actually see a list that goes up to 911. And this was taken in the immediate aftermath of the Proskурov pogrom. Local do-gooders came around and they collected the names of the dead. And they sent those to central authorities, to the Central Committee for the Aid of Pogrom Victims that was trying to collect testimonies and to record the names of everybody who was killed. We have in total about 33,000 names of people who were killed during these pogroms. In 1921, a few years after the pogroms, the Soviet government did an investigation, and they concluded, based on sampling, that the names account for about 1/3 of the total number of victims. And that's how we get to 100,000 as the official figure for the number of people killed during the pogroms. So I had come across many of these instances, many of these recollections of pogroms and lists of pogroms, and I started to wonder why this wasn't such an integral part of European history. We knew about it, this was not completely new, but it hadn't really entered into the way we think about the Holocaust, for instance, even though it happened 20 years earlier in the same places in which the mass killings began. So I was curious about whether people were talking about it at the time. And in fact, I found lots of evidence that they were. Here's an article from the New York Times in September 1919. Ukrainian Jews aim to stop pogroms. Mass meeting hears that 127,000 Jews have been killed and 6 million are in peril. And this article ends with the sentence, "This fact that the population of 6 million souls in Ukraine and Poland have received notice through action and by word that they are going to be completely exterminated. This fact stands before the whole world as the paramount issue of the present day." So we can see that in 1919 already, people were talking about the forthcoming murder of 6 million Jews in Ukraine and Poland. To the people who lived through the pogroms, the Holocaust was not unanticipated, it was not unimaginable. It was, in fact, part of their recent memory. And just to give you some other examples, here's a special edition of the Literary Digest called "Will a Slaughter of Jews Be Next European Horror?" Here's some other quotes from the Russian Red Cross Relief Committee for the Victim of Pogroms, concluding that the task that the pogrom movement set itself was to rid Ukraine of all Jews and to carry it out in many cases by the wholesale physical extermination of the race. Emma Goldman spoke about the wholesale slaughter of the Jews. Anatole France, the French writer, and this is actually where the title of my book comes from, wrote that the pogroms threatened the Jews with complete extinction. In the very midst of civilized Europe, he wrote, at the dawn of a new era, the existence of a whole population is threatened. And in fact, the more research I did on this, the more it seemed that in the interwar period, everybody is talking about the coming destruction of the Jews. This seems to be the dominant narrative. People are writing novels about it, doing paintings about it, giving warnings about it, and they're acting as much as they can in order to prevent what they see as the coming destruction of the Jews. They are acting by petitioning the great powers as they meet in Paris in 1919. During the time that these pogroms are taking place, at that very time, the leaders of the world are all meeting together in Paris to work out the treaties that are going to end World War I. And there are Jewish delegations that go and say to them, the Jews are going to be killed unless you do something to prevent that. And the world powers agree, and they say, okay, we're going to make Poland put in minority rights into its constitution. We'll insist that Romania put minority rights into their constitution. At the same time, there's a huge movement to promote Jewish migration to Palestine as the only solution to the Jewish question, because they believe in the coming destruction of the Jews of Eastern Europe. So it was recognized at the time that something like this was going to happen, and they saw the pogroms as only the beginning of this period of violence. And you saw in the video clips that I gave you how 90 years later it still has an impact. And again, we're talking only 20 years later. What I have here is an article from The Nation called The Murder of a Race, as though they're searching for the term genocide that had yet to be invented at the time. Now, there's an irony here that this violence took place in Ukraine, because Ukraine was, at the time, one of the most tolerant states in Europe. It had just declared its independence just a month earlier, but there had been remnants of it, or there had been a Ukrainian state that existed beforehand. And the leaders of that Ukrainian state wanted to establish a multi-ethnic state that gave all of the different peoples of different ethnicities in that state equal rights. And Jews around the world were rejoicing at this. And what you see here is a 100 karbavanya, it's $100 note that was published in Ukraine, the official currency of Ukraine. And you can see it's got Yiddish writing on it because they made Yiddish one of the official languages of this new country. They established a ministry of Jewish affairs and had the Jews elect their own person to represent them. And they gave the Jews what were called collective rights, which is that the Jews had rights as a collective. A certain amount of the taxation would go to Jewish schools, would go to fund Jewish schools, to fund Jewish courts. Jews would have the right to petition the government in Yiddish. All of these public rights, national rights that were embraced by Jewish communities around the world, such that here's just a typical quote from Der Tog, which is a New York-based Yiddish newspaper, saying, for the first time in all Jewish history, the Jewish people will be recognized by a government as an equal part of the general population, not only in a civil and political sense, but in a national sense. So in fact, the concerns of most world Jewry was about what was happening in Poland rather than what was happening in Ukraine, where there were also pogroms, but far fewer pogroms than what was taking place in Ukraine. They knew about the pogroms in Poland because they had access to Poland, whereas Ukraine was embroiled in this civil war that made it very difficult to gain access and to learn about what was actually happening on the ground. So I've said that the Ukrainian government had this tolerant attitude towards Jews. You may then wonder why the pogroms were being perpetrated and who was perpetrating them. And the answer is they were perpetrated for a wide variety of reasons by many different parties. One was simply loot. And you can see here in this destroyed store, you can see that Jews tended to have the stores in the center of town. And one reason that violence was perpetrated against them was in order to get foodstuffs, was to get food from the stores, to get liquor from the liquor stores that they tended to own. In Ukraine, the structure of the town was normally that in the center of town around the marketplace were the Jewish shops and the peasants lived in the outskirts. So this is why I said earlier that in many ways we can interpret this violence as the countryside against the city. As you can see, as the countryside against the city. and people looting in order simply for gain, for monetary gain. And we see this also, by the way, as we've come to understand that it is also one of the main or one of the major reasons for violence during the Holocaust was also in order to acquire goods. But another was because the Jews were closely associated with Bolshevism. And this is, you can see this in this white propaganda poster, which is entitled The Coat of Arms of Lev Trotsky. And the leader of the Bolshevik movement was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky, who is very well known to be from Jewish background, represented Bolshevism to the West and represented Bolshevism to the people of Ukraine. Although Vladimir Lenin, who was not Jewish, was the real leader of the Bolsheviks sitting in St. Petersburg, most people recognized the leader of the Bolsheviks to be Trotsky. He was a more recognizable figure, and he also tended, since he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and also the Minister of War, he tended to represent them to the West. So in this poster, you can see very anti-Semitic characteristical pictures of Trotsky. You can see the word Talmud and the Jewish star, and you can see that's a perversion of the Russian eagle, of the double-headed eagle, but looking like Trotsky. And then in this other propaganda poster, you can see Jesus being led to the cross, and overseeing it, looking in the bottom right corner, is Trotsky. This poster takes traditional anti-Semitism, traditional religious-based hostility towards the Jews, and uses it as anti-Bolshevik propaganda. You can see all of the people leading Jesus to the cross as well are Bolshevik soldiers. They're Red Army soldiers, Red Army sailors, Red Army soldiers, all of whom are mocking Christ as he is led to the cross. This, of course, draws upon the traditional image of Jews as the killers of Christ. And now, in place of Jews, it's Bolshevik Jews who are killing Christ. And in fact, the pogroms were perpetrated by a whole range of people, not just those who opposed the Bolsheviks, but a range of people. And here you can see, this is also from The Nation, a diagram of who the main perpetrators of the pogroms were. And it shows the Poles here perpetrated 38 pogroms, the Ukrainians perpetrated 54, the Russians 93, and these neighbors, what they call bands, 509. I'll talk about that in a second. But I just want to say that the Jews were, as this area fell apart in conflict, in ethnic conflict, the Jews were represented on all sides. So no matter which side you were on, there was a Jew to blame. The Poles accused the Jews of sympathizing with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians accused the Jews of sympathizing with the Poles. The Russian imperialist army accused the Jews of siding with the Germans, and the Germans accused the Jews of siding with the Russians. The Bolsheviks accused the Jews of being capitalists, of being bourgeois capitalists, and everybody else accused the Jews of being Bolsheviks. So no matter which side they were on, there was always some Jews to blame. And this is why every side in the conflict targeted the Jews for their own reasons. But most of the conflict was actually perpetrated, or the largest number of pogroms were perpetrated by these bands, like in the Tulchin pogrom, just by regular peasants who were fighting against the city. And one reason that this happened was because their leaders had a lot of trouble convincing peasants to go against the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were promising the peasants things that the peasants wanted. The Bolsheviks promised land, bread, and peace. And if you are an opponent, if you're part of the old regime, it's very difficult to convince people to fight against land, bread, and peace. So what they did was said, listen, these people aren't really going to give you land, bread, and peace because really they're Jews. They're just Jews, and they're going to steal your churches and turn them into synagogues, and they're going to kill your children. This was the allegation. And that's a powerful allegation because it drew upon long-standing superstitions about Jews as the killers of children, and Jews as holding keys to churches who are going to prevent people from going into churches. So it built upon these stereotypes. The Bolsheviks recognized the power of these stereotypes, And so they started cracking down on pogroms and told their army, they told the Red Army not to perpetrate pogroms against Jews, as a result of which Jews started to view the Red Army as their savior and joined the Red Army in greater numbers. And that created a self-fulfilling prophecy. As more Jews joined the Red Army, the association between Jews and Bolshevism became stronger. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about these 509 pogroms that were perpetrated against bands, against locals, and show you what some of those local bands looked like. This is a portrait of the band of Struk. It was Lechovich band that perpetrated the pogrom in Tulchin. Struk's band perpetrated pogroms mostly in the area around Chernobyl. You probably know Chernobyl from the nuclear power plant, the nuclear power disaster. But before that, there was a very large Jewish community living in Chernobyl. And these are the warlords that perpetrated those pogroms in the Chernobyl region. And you can see in this picture, they're posing in a photographic studio as Cossack warriors. But really, they're just children. The suits, the outfits don't fit them. They're sitting on a play horse. You know, these are kids who are 15, looks like they're maybe 15, 16 years old. They could even be younger. And these are children who in 1919 had lived the last 5 years of their lives in utter war, as so much of World War I was fought in this area. Their fathers, who they were emulating, instead of being farmers, their fathers had been soldiers in the army and were fighting in the army. They were just kids, and all they knew was warfare. And these kids would go out and they would go into the towns where the Jews were, and they would harass the Jews and often kill the Jews in many ways because it's all that they knew. We have many cases of the parents telling them to stop it. We have many cases of parents saying, my child, you know, was killing Jews, was attacking Jews. I told him to stop. I told him he was going to get into trouble, but he wouldn't do it. Things like that. And what happened after the Bolsheviks came into power was they started prosecuting pogrom perpetrators. And so we have Jewish tribunals like this one, and you see in this report, that are sentencing the perpetrators of pogroms to death beginning in 1921. And what this meant is these were the kids. You can see in this, I don't know if you can see the numbers, but you can see that one of them is 26 years old, one is 18 years old, and this is in 1921. So the 18-year-old was 16 years old in 1919 when he was perpetrating the pogrom that he was killed for. So this gives the impression to many people in the village that, oh, now that the Jews are in charge, they're coming after us and they are killing our people because they're killing these warlords. They're killing these peasant bandits who had perpetrated the pogroms. And this then leads to a situation, to the growth of animosities between Ukrainians and Jews, and the perception that the Jews have been perpetrating atrocities against the Ukrainians. This perception becomes even more relevant when there's a massive famine in Ukraine in 32, 33, that's perpetrated by the Stalinist state, and Jews are often blamed for having perpetrated that famine. This is just a quote from the historian Leonard Shapiro, who points out that so many of those who did the shooting, who shot these pogrom perpetrators, were of Jewish backgrounds. And one reason, again, is because Jews joined the Red Army and they joined these tribunals in order to get revenge for those who had killed their parents. I'll talk for another minute or so, but I just want to mention one other component of these pogroms that contributes to what happened 20 years later, and that's the mass movement of migration, that hundreds of thousands of Jews fled the region afterwards, and they fled mostly, or large numbers of them anyway, fled into Germany. And there, in Germany, there was this huge influx of poor Jews fleeing pogroms, and the Germans, or many Germans, believed that they were importing Bolshevism. The same thing, by the way, happened in the United States, where there was a Bolshevik scare around this period as refugees from the pogroms were fleeing into the United States, and it took place elsewhere in Europe as well. But here I have a quote from Albert Einstein talking about how the confrontational attitude towards these unfortunate refugees who escaped the hell that Eastern Europe is today has become an efficient and politically successful weapon used by demagogues. So Einstein, who was a pretty smart guy, recognizing already in the interwar period that these refugees from pogroms are being used by demagogues as a source of, as a way of gaining supporters. And in fact, here you see in the Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi newspaper soon after it was bought by the Nazis, a headline against the Eastern European Jews. And they used in their early propaganda particularly focused on Eastern European Jews coming into Germany who were fleeing pogroms and blamed for importing Bolshevism. And then I just want to skip ahead for my last two slides here to show you some of the propaganda that was used in Ukraine in 1941. This is Jewish Bolshevism, says this one. And then another instance of violence against Jews in 1941. This is the pogrom in Lviv, Ukraine, which was a pogrom perpetrated, well, instigated by the Germans and perpetrated by ordinary Ukrainians against Jews, one of the first acts of mass violence in the immediate aftermath of the German occupation of the Soviet Union. And the Germans purposely roused up the Ukrainian population by urging them to take revenge on the Jews for what they had done during this period, during the Civil War period, for having killed their children through the tribunals, and for having perpetrated what he claimed were atrocities against the Ukrainian people. So we see in June 1941, particularly, there's a deliberate association that the Germans are making between the pogroms of 1919 and what they are doing and the mass murders that they are carrying out right then and there. So for all those reasons, I think there is a connection here. I don't think this is the sole cause of the Holocaust by any means, but I think it's one aspect of the Holocaust that we really haven't paid much attention to, the legacy of violence in this region before. And that's what my book does, is urges us to try to pay attention to this, to try to take this into account, to recognize the violence that had been committed against Jews just 20 years earlier in these same towns. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I mean, this is tough reading, but it is reading everybody should look at who wants to understand the prehistory of the Holocaust and understand that the atrocities definitely did not start in 1939 or 33 or 39 or 41. I would just ask everyone who has questions, please put them in the Q&A function, not in the chat. Thank you. We already have a few, but we'll start a little bit on a, virtual panel. So actually, let me start with when my wife saw the book laying on my desk and she saw the title In the Midst of Civilized Europe, she's like, what's civilized Europe? And if you read the book, you think, wow, you really need a different definition of what civilized mean. If you read this page by page, it is really brutal. And that happened in the midst of Europe, and it is happening in different forms since then. You also say at one point that Ukraine lost about 20% of their population between 1914 and 1921. That's huge, and I don't know if all of them were killed. Some of them fled, I assume. So I want to contextualize a little bit more what you were saying, which is so much in your book as well. If somebody would say, well, Ukraine lost 20% of their population, so how is it different what happened to the Jews, as there were Russians fighting against Ukrainians, Ukrainians against Poles, whites against reds, right? Communists against the nationalists. How was the violence against the Jews different from that? And I'm taking some of the questions I already see in the Q&A. How was this violence different from the pogroms in Tsarist Russia?
Yeah, so both great questions. The contextualization that, yes, this was taking place in the midst of not civilization, although I use that title for a variety of reasons, but in the midst of absolute unimaginable violence, and is a part of that violence. By the same token, of course, the Holocaust, particularly in Eastern Europe, takes place in the midst of enormous violence. And this is, an argument that a lot of Holocaust obfuscators in Eastern Europe make about the Holocaust is, yes, Jews were killed in 1941 in Ukraine, but so were Ukrainians. And why are you differentiating the murder of Jews from the murder of Ukrainians? This is, of course, distinct from the death camps, which is a whole nother matter. But just speaking about the Einsatzgruppen killings, about the mobile unit killings, and about the massacres, the Holocaust by bullets, so to speak, which is taking place in the context of war. So yes, this does take place in the context of war, as do most genocides. The difference is the concentration of killing on the civilian population, and every side of the conflict killing peaceful Jewish citizens. These are not people who are fighting, who are being killed. These are civilians who are being killed in their homes through door-to-door violence. And although that does happen to other groups, Mennonites are also targeted, by the way. Nobody on the scale of the Jews. And none of the propaganda of any of the groups is geared against against another group in quite the same way as the Jews. The Jews are imagined by virtually all sides of the conflict as the major instigators of the conflict and of the violence taking place. So it's a similar type of argument that you could make for the Holocaust in 1941, is that the role of the Jews is special because in the Holocaust, it's really major one side, but in this case, all sides are seeing the Jews as the root of their problems and are seeking to completely exterminate Jews, to go into villages and kill all of the Jews in the village, which we have taken place. There's one instance where they gather all of the Jews together in the synagogue and burn down the synagogue, in which a reported 3,000 people are killed as the synagogue is burned to the ground. So there's numerous instances of this type of genocidal violence taking place, which is not happening against other groups. Just in response to how it's different from previous waves of pogroms, it's different for those reasons as well. The Jews are being singled out for really genocidal killing, for killing all of the Jews in the village. And then just the scale of it. The 1881 pogroms, which are the first major wave of pogroms, result in the deaths of about 24 people. The 1903 to 1906 pogroms result in the death of about 3,000 to 5,000. And 1918 to 1921 results in the death of 100,000. So it's just exponential growth. And of course, 41 even more than that.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm connecting with some questions here. Barbara Bala, for example, asked about her. A lot of people talk about their own family stories, and she says, my great-grandparents, probably in Teplik, Ukraine, were killed by the Veidlinger in the interwar year period. And you mentioned lists of those murders. How can one find copies? I would like to add to this, because that was one of the fascinating readings. As you say, it seemed like somehow paradoxical. I mean, Veidlinger is, of course, well known also because he was killed later by a young Jew in Paris. And he was, the jury found him not guilty, although it was clear he killed him, but he was not found not guilty because of the atrocities Veidlinger was accused of. Now, you also show that the same Ukrainian state where Veidlinger was involved was one of the first to give Jews autonomy, and even he had some Jewish politicians around him supporting him. And I think that is something really fascinating. So, I mean, even Israel Zangwill, the famous Jewish writer, commended him in an open letter. So how do you, after all you've read, judge his role? And of course, please answer the question about how to find copies of those lists.
Yeah, so copies of the lists are located in the EVO Archives, and they've actually recently been digitized. So if you go to the EVO Archives, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, EVO Archives at the Center for Jewish History in New York, and you can even go to the website online. And it's, I believe it's record group 80, and you can find the entire archive of, I think 80,000 pages of documentation, including lists of the names of the dead. It's organized by town, so you can actually do some pretty good research there. That, of course, only became available online after I finished my book. Would have saved me years if it was available online before. And then to the question, which I've now forgotten. What was the question, Michael?
The Petlura's role.
Oh, Petlura, right? Petlura's responsibility. So Petlura, I didn't mention him by name in this talk because I really don't think he's all that significant. Petlura was the head of the Ukrainian state, and particularly the head of the army, of the Ukrainian army. I don't think, although he was blamed, widely blamed for perpetrating the pogroms, I don't think he was responsible for them. He didn't seem to order them. He also didn't do enough to stop them. But in fairness, he was the commander-in-chief of an army that had only been created a month before. So he really had very little control over his own army. He was too busy defending Ukraine against Bolsheviks and against the incursion from the Red Army. There really was trying to destroy Ukraine and take over from one side, and from the Russian Imperial Army that was trying to destroy him on the other side, to worry about exactly what his military was doing in these towns. He could have, and he eventually does, a few months later, he starts to come down against pogroms, but it was just too chaotic for him to fully know what was going on. And what his own military units were doing. It just goes to show that the units themselves were all perpetrating this on their own accord. It goes to show the widespread anti-Jewish feeling that existed through broad segments of society, even without direct commands from central authorities. So we always want to ascribe this type of violence to some distant central authority, which is the easy way of explaining it. But I think it's actually, the reality is much more disturbing, which is it's not being ordered by one central authority, but actually is being perpetrated by hugely large groups of people.
Yeah, thank you. One question that comes always to my mind and came to my mind in my own research about the rise of Hitler in Munich in 1919-20, he himself describes his rise later in his Mein Kampf to the Jewish revolution, a lot to the Jewish revolutionaries in Munich in 1918-19. And sure, they played a very prominent role in Munich in 1918-19, as they did, as you show, in the Communist Party in certain areas, in the secret police and other areas of the early Soviet state. And the question I always ask myself, and that's of course a hypothetical question, do you think it would have been any different if there were less or no Jews playing these roles in the early Bolshevik movement?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The counterfactual. I do actually. I mean, it's when you look at particularly in these small towns in Ukraine, if you look at the role of Jews in the revolutionary movement, it really is immense. That for a variety of reasons, they were joining the Red Army in particular. They were joining the Red Army because the Red Army promised them salvation. It didn't perpetrate pogroms. At least after a certain point, the Red Army stopped perpetrating pogroms. And what would typically happen is a town would be threatened by a peasant gang, and maybe initially the Jews tried to raise a self-defense brigade, but they quickly realized that they would be overwhelmed by the weapons of the other side if they had a self-defense brigade. They just couldn't defend themselves on their own. And so they would wait there, and then the Red Army would come, would liberate them, and the Red Army would say, now, to thank us for liberating you, we expect you to join us. And the Jews would join the Red Army, and the Red Army would essentially become their self-defense brigade. And they would take their weapons and they would join, not because they believed in communism any more than anybody else did, not because they were Bolsheviks for any particular ideological reason, but they joined the Red Army because the Red Army gave them arms and said, we're going to defend you against these people who killed your parents. And we're going to allow you to protect yourselves and to take revenge against those who killed your parents. And they joined, and that helped create this self-fulfilling prophecy that I call. And then when Ukrainians flee places, they get the impression and start to associate Jews with Bolshevism very closely. And then they flee to Germany, and they take that assumption with them and spread it in Germany, as well as throughout Europe. It had existed previously, for sure, the association between Jews and revolutionaries, but it becomes more of a reality in Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks. And of course, as you said, at the same time, for many communists, the Jews were the enemies as the bourgeois. These were the other Jews. But I want to take a few more questions from the audience. I know you have to go in 10 minutes, so I guess we'll have to be brief also in answering them. Richard Brightman, my colleague from AU, you referred to traditional anti-Semitism, modern political anti-Semitism, and specific local circumstances. Do you have a sense of which is most important and which least?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are so many different forms of anti-Jewish sentiments. It's hard to differentiate them. You know, I try not to use the word anti-Semitism in the book because it has all types of different meanings. I do use it occasionally for some specific reasons, but I prefer anti-Jewish sentiment or anti-Jewish prejudices, which are existing in these towns. And they're so intertwined. They're intertwined with religion, they're intertwined with politics, they're intertwined with sociology. I think it's important to recognize how disparate the communities were with Jews in the cities and Ukrainians in the countryside. So for so many people, it's the countryside against the city, and that's interpreted as the Christians against the Jews, because that's in many cases what it is. So it's all intertwined. They're using motifs from religious anti-Semitism and motifs from political anti-Semitism. So it's a difficult question to answer, but a good question to ask.
Thank you. And Jonathan Band asks, what is the evidence of the awareness of Hitler and other Nazis about these pogroms in Ukraine and the rhetoric of the destruction of the Jewish communities in Poland and Ukraine?
Yeah, so not so much from Hitler himself, but certainly the military officials who are moving into Ukraine talk about it. And they talk about it in the reports that they send back. They talk about it when they are, the Nazi leadership talks about it in trying to encourage the population. They specifically issue orders urging the people in the field, ordering the Germans in the field to rouse up the local Ukrainian population with talk of pogroms. In fact, they give this, the last slide I showed was the Lviv pogrom, is commonly called the Petliura days. And that name was given by the German occupying forces, who specifically called it the Petliura days in order to rouse up the population with the memory of Petliura. So they're talking about it internally, and they certainly know about it.
Thank you. My colleague Aaron Kermel asks or says, I came to your wonderful talk because my own grandparents were from East Poland, Rivne, which I think actually I remember figures in your book, and Bialystok and Vilna. How do you compare the Ukraine pogroms you described to what happened just west of them? Which leads us to the question, what is Ukraine anyway, I guess?
Right, so Rivne is no longer Eastern Poland, but is now Ukraine. So it depends, you know, how we're talking about it. But yes, the pogroms in Ukraine were much more severe than the pogroms in Poland. There were pogroms in Poland during this period as well. And what's interesting is that the world Jewish community that was trying to raise awareness of these pogroms got confused between the two. Ukraine was a complete war zone. There was no possibility of getting aid to Jews in Ukraine. There was no possibility of sending journalists in Ukraine to investigate what was going on or to send US commissions. The United States didn't have relations with the Soviet Union, so they couldn't send any formal, formal investigative bodies into Ukraine, but they could into Poland. So there were lots of investigations of the pogroms in Poland, most famously Morgenthau's investigation, but very few in Ukraine. And what they found in Poland was that the pogroms were not as serious as they had been made to seem. But the problem was that the real atrocities, the major atrocities were taking place in Ukraine, not in Poland. So these commissions visited the wrong cities. They were visiting Polish cities instead of Ukrainian cities. And if they'd visited Ukrainian cities, I think they would have come to a different conclusion.
And the question that, of course, is hard to answer, but it always appears by Ralph Sonnenschein. Why did the Ukrainians in 1919 hate the Jews so much? Is there lingering violent anti-Semitism in Ukraine today?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that the Ukrainians did hate the Jews so much. Again, it was a period of such violence and war, and the Jews represented so many different things to them. There were these ancient, or not ancient, but there were these old religious prejudices against Jews. Jews were a separate group. They were the people in the city. They were regarded as being the revolutionaries. So I think for all those reasons is why they perpetrated atrocities against Jews. Hatred is a difficult concept to measure. But I think it has nothing to do with them being Ukrainian per se, because at the same time, the Ukrainian state was offering all of these, was offering autonomy to the Jews and was offering all of these privileges and rights to the Jewish community. So it's difficult. I don't really think we can measure it by nationality. I think any nationality living in the situation that Ukraine was in 1919, having undergone these 5 years of absolute brutal war, could have been subjected or could have undergone the type of violence that took place in Ukraine.
And John Efron commends you for wonderful talk. And he says, in thinking about the Law and Justice Party in Poland today, and its refusal to countenance any Polish responsibility for violence against Jews during the Shoah, what is the attitude of the Ukrainian government? And we should say it's a Jewish prime minister, right? Or president today to reckoning with the past?
So that's another great question. And yes, I think Ukraine right now is not having the same type of obstinate refusal to recognize Ukrainian responsibility for violence against Jews that Poland is having. Poland right now has a law, or has elements of a law that make it a crime to even accuse Poles of responsibility. That doesn't happen in Ukraine. But Ukraine is having trouble dealing with its past. And there are still, there's a Petlura street in the center of Kiev, and Petlura is still regarded as a hero of Ukrainian independence. And it's a difficult past that they have to grapple with. I don't think that's unique to Ukraine. We in the United States are grappling with our own difficult past, and we also have historical heroes who have pasts that some people are saying we haven't fully taken account of. And we also have still have statues of Confederate heroes in our cities, and are grappling with those issues ourselves, and even are coming to recognize that some of the very founding fathers of the American state have had racist pasts. So Ukraine isn't unique in that way. It's a young country that's struggling to come to terms with the complexities of their past and of the people who made Ukraine the state it is today.
Sorry, there are many more questions. I know you have to go soon. I'll take a last one by Susan Albright. Thanks so much for your amazing talk. It is important to learn from the past to guide us in the future. What advice do you have for Jews, for American government as we move forward today?
What advice for Jews for, what was it, for Jews for the American government?
And for the American government, I guess 2 questions.
Yeah, well, I think I mean, there's many, and I don't, there's many, and without getting into the intricacies of current politics. First of all, I do hope that we will be able to defend Ukrainian independence against Russian aggression that's taking place. And I worry about the possibilities of, will the Jews be blamed for this round of violence as well? As in the past round of violence, Jews aren't actually responsible for anything taking place, but yet there are powerful Jews on both sides of the conflict. And I can foresee a circumstance in which Jews get blamed one way or the other. So I would be worried about that, but I'm more worried just for Ukraine in general than for the Jews in Ukraine. But I think the main lesson that we get from this is that violence begets violence. And once you've broken this mental barrier to commit atrocities against people, it becomes much easier to do so the next time around. And I think that's the general lesson of this experience, is that violence has to be put down as soon as it happens. Like in the first clip I showed where the Polish priest says, enough, go home. We need more people to say enough, go home when violence starts to break out, because otherwise it festers and it doesn't go away. And 20 years later, it can resurface in much more severe manners than happened the first time around.
Thank you. And I remember you have a very powerful quote in your book by President Clinton, what he said during a visit to Kigali in Rwanda in 1994, where he says, each bloodletting hastens the next, as the value of human life is degraded, and violence becomes tolerated, the unimaginable becomes more conceivable. And I think that's something we see here as well. I would like to remind our audience that that book is, of course, available, and the link to purchases is in the chat. It is published with Metropolitan Books. And I really highly recommend it, not only because it teaches, of course, something of an era we all know not enough about, but also I think we saw in your presentation that you used so many different ways of sources, and you and other colleagues went to the Ukraine years ago to use the last chance to interview these people in Yiddish who were still witnesses, of course, of the much even worse atrocities, World War II, but some of them even remembered that as children, like remember from the moving clips you showed us. But you also used so many archival sources from Russia, from Ukraine, from other countries. So this is really original reading, tough reading, but so well written. And I really want to thank you for being with us today and for writing this book. I want to thank our audience. And I also want to remind you that this is the first in a series of book presentations. The next one will take place on February 2nd, on Wednesday, February 2nd at 1 p.m. And it's with Jaslyn Granick on international Jewish humanitarianism in the age of the Great War. I would also like to remind those who are interested in Israeli politics that on February 7th, our Center for Israel Studies is hosting a virtual talk with former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni. And if you want to get more information, or if you're not on our list yet, please just write an email to the Center for Israel Studies at American University. Thank you all so much, and especially thanks to my colleague, Pamela Nadell, to Laura Cutler, and of course to you, Jeff, for being with us today. And we're looking forward to your next book already.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Thanks.